Welcome, guys, to class. Today, we're going to be discussing drug agonists. But before we discuss drug agonists, it is important that we discuss drug ligand. First of all, we discuss drug ligand. So, what is a drug ligand? A drug ligand is a molecule that binds to a drug receptor and activate or deactivate it. So a drug ligand is a molecule that binds to a drug receptor and either activates it or it deactivates it. So the role of drug ligands is actually to bind the receptor and in the process either activate the receptor or deactivate the receptor. And a very important thing about drug ligands is that drug ligands they are very specific in action. They are usually very, very specific in action. Drug ligands. And drug ligand binding to receptor causes two things. So when a ligand binds to receptor, two things happen. There could be activation of the receptor or there could be blockade of the receptor. So when a ligand binds to a drug receptor and activate it, they are usually called drug agonists. But when a ligand binds to a receptor and block it or causes blockade, they are usually called antagonists. So when ligands bind to receptors and activate them, they are called agonists. And when ligands bind to receptors and block them, they are called antagonists. So agonists, antagonists. And drug ligands could be grouped into two major classes. They could be agonists, they could also be antagonists. So, what is a drug agonist? A drug agonist is actually a ligand that binds to specific receptors and activates them, leading to different and various pharmacological or physiological responses. So, drug agonists are usually ligands. First of all, they are ligands. They bind to specific receptors and activate them, leading to various pharmacological and physiological responses. So you have a drug agonist. This is the drug receptor. It binds to this receptor. So agonist bind to receptor, forms a drug receptor complex, leading to full activation of the receptor and thereby leading to physiological or pharmacological responses. So a drug agonist binds to a drug receptor, then we have a drug receptor complex formed, and that leads to the activation of the receptor, leading to physiological and pharmacological responses. So we have three types of drug agonists. We have full agonist, partial agonist, and inverse agonist. We have full agonist, partial agonist, and inverse agonist. And all agonists of drugs are usually broadly divided into two based on their sources. They could be endogenous, that is, they are produced within the body, and they could also be exogenous. So we go to the first type of agonist that are called full agonist. So what is a full agonist? A full agonist is a ligand that binds to a receptor and it produces maximal response or efficacy. So full agonists are ligands that binds to receptors and produce maximal response or efficacy. So if you look at this drug response curve, this is the response percentage and this is the drug concentration. So a full agonist will bring about 100% efficacy. To bring about 100% efficacy, a full agonist will bring about 100% efficacy. Okay, so they display 100% efficacy. And examples of full agonists are morphine at the opioid receptors. We also have acetylcholine at muscarinic receptors and acetylcholine at nicotinic receptors. So morphine causes full activation of opioid receptors. Similarly, acetylcholine causes full activation of muscarinic receptors and also nicotinic receptors. So because acetylcholine causes full activation of muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors, it is called a full agonist. So the next we have are partial agonists. Partial agonists. So what are partial agonists? Partial agonists are usually ligands that bind to receptors and they activate them, but they do not produce the response of full agonists. So partial agonists are usually ligands that bind to receptors, activate them, but they do not produce a response of full agonists, even when they are in excess amount. So no matter the amount of partial agonists you have, partial agonists can never produce 100% efficacy. So usually they produce 50% of the response produced by full agonists. Full agonists produce 100% efficacy. Partial agonists produce uh, 50% efficacy. So they can never produce 100% efficacy no matter how much they are in concentration. So partial agonists produce about 50% efficacy. And an example of partial agonist is buspirone. Buspirone is a partial agonist and it acts via 5-HT receptors. It acts via serotonin receptors and it is used for treating anxiety disorders. And the last class of receptors for today are, the last class of agonists for today are the inverse agonists. Inverse agonists. So what are inverse agonists? Inverse agonists are usually ligands that bind to receptors and they decrease the activity of receptors. So they actually bind the receptors and they decrease the activity of receptors to their inactive state. So this is a response drawn consideration of an inverse agonist. So inverse agonists decrease the activity of the receptors. So the response given by inverse agonists is usually a decreased activity. So inverse agonists lead to decrease in receptor activity. And examples of inverse agonists are flumazenil. Flumazenil is an inverse agonist. Flumazenil is an inverse agonist and is an inverse agonist at the GABA receptors. So these are the major classes of receptors and their agonists that we have. Thank you.